Every satisfying downfall begins long before the first crack appears. Before the armies, before the blood on marble floors, before a kingdom learned what happens when a man mistakes possession for love. It starts in silence, in the quiet machinery of control so absolute that even the man holding the levers forgets he is also trapped inside the machine. Lucien Ravenscar believed he owned everything worth owning. He was wrong about exactly one thing, and that one thing would burn his empire to the ground. Stay until the end. You will want to see how it happens. The morning Lucien Ravenscar discovered treachery growing inside his own house, the weather cooperated with poetic cruelty. Rain hammered the black spires of Blackthorne Castle like artillery fire, turning the limestone courtyards into shallow rivers that carried dead leaves toward iron drainage grates, older than most noble families in England. The sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the Yorkshire moors with the patience of a predator waiting for something wounded to stop moving. Inside the East Wing study, Lucien stood motionless before a mahogany desk covered in correspondence. His posture carried the rigidity of a man who had trained himself never to display uncertainty, even when alone. Tall, sharp-featured, with silver-gray eyes that functioned less as organs of sight than instruments of measurement. He assessed everything, trusted nothing. It was not paranoia. Paranoia implied irrationality. Lucien's suspicion was mathematical. Decades of political warfare had taught him that human loyalty operated on a transactional spectrum, and every transaction had an expiration date. He picked up the letter again. Read it a third time. The handwriting belonged to Lord Pemberton, a minor parliamentary ally whose usefulness had always been limited to reliable intelligence about backbench sentiment. The content was mundane. Committee schedules, voting predictions, a reference to rising grain prices in the southern counties. But folded inside the second page, almost invisible against the cream-colored stationery, was a smaller note written in a different hand entirely. 4 words. Ashbourne dines with her. Lucien set the note down with the careful precision of a man placing a loaded weapon on a table. His jaw tightened. The muscles along his neck shifted beneath the starched collar of his shirt. He did not raise his voice. He did not move toward the bell pull to summon a servant. He simply stood there, letting the information settle into the architecture of his mind the way acid settles into stone. Ashbourne. Lord Cedric Ashbourne. War hero, parliamentary darling. The man whose name appeared in London newspapers more frequently than the king's. Cedric had returned from the colonial campaigns with medals pinned to his chest and a reputation for inspiring devotion among soldiers who would have otherwise deserted into the jungle. He was handsome in the careless way that aristocratic women found irresistible. Broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, and cursed with the dangerous gift of making every person in a room feel individually important. Lucien despised him with the specificity of a man who understood exactly what made his enemy effective. Cedric did not threaten through strength, he threatened through warmth. And warmth was the one currency Lucien had never learned to counterfeit. He crossed the study and pulled a leather cord hanging beside the fireplace. Within 40 seconds, his chief steward appeared in the doorway. Hargrove was 63 years old, gray as November, and had served Blackthorne Castle for 4 decades. He understood his master the way a hound understands weather, not through reason, but through instinct, refined by survival. "The Duchess," Lucien said without turning from the window. "Where did she take supper last Thursday?" "At Ashford House, Your Grace. Lady Whitmore hosted a gathering for charitable." "Who attended?" Hargrove hesitated. The pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In Blackthorne Castle, 2 seconds of silence carried the weight of a confession. "I will need to consult the records, Your Grace." "You already know." Lucien turned. His eyes found Hargrove's face with the patience of a blade finding the space between ribs. "You have always known. That is why I employ you." The steward's throat moved visibly. "Lord Ashbourne was among the guests." "How many times this month?" 3 occasions, Your Grace. The charity supper, a concert at Belmont Hall, and a private luncheon hosted by the Countess of— 3. Lucien repeated the number as though tasting something rotten. "And you chose not to inform me." "The gatherings were public, Your Grace. The Duchess's attendance was appropriate to her station, and— Leave." Hargrove left. He had served long enough to recognize the specific quality of silence that followed Lucien's dismissals. There was the ordinary silence of a man finished speaking, and there was the silence of a man deciding how much damage to inflict. This was the second kind. Lucien stood alone for a long time after that. Rain continued its assault against the windows. The fire in the grate had burned down to a bed of orange coals that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. He did not pour whiskey. He did not pace. He stood with both hands flat on the desk surface, weight distributed evenly, chin slightly lowered, breathing with the controlled rhythm of a man preventing himself from breaking something irreplaceable. The truth was simple, and it burned like swallowed glass. Serafina was not having an affair. That would have been easier. An affair was a transaction, and transactions could be intercepted, punished, terminated. What was happening was far worse. She was choosing someone else's company. Voluntarily. Without coercion, without political obligation, without any of the strategic calculations that governed every interaction in Lucien's world, his wife was walking into rooms where Cedric Ashbourne stood, and she was smiling. Not the practiced smile she wore at court functions like porcelain armor, not the careful diplomatic expression she maintained during state dinners. A real smile. The kind that reached her eyes and changed the geometry of her face in ways that made Lucien feel like a stranger studying a painting he could never afford to buy. He had married Serafina Vale 4 years ago in a ceremony that resembled a military alliance more than a wedding. The Vale family controlled shipping interests along the southern coast. The Ravenscar dynasty needed maritime leverage to offset declining influence in the northern territories. The contract was negotiated between lawyers for 6 months before either party spoke directly. When they finally met in person, 3 weeks before the ceremony, Lucien had studied her the way he studied any new acquisition. Looking for structural weaknesses, hidden liabilities, maintenance costs. What he found instead was a woman who looked directly at him without lowering her eyes. That should have been his first warning. The following morning arrived with the false brightness that Yorkshire weather sometimes deployed between storms, as though the landscape wanted to remind its inhabitants that beauty was temporary and not to be trusted. Lucien found Serafina in the East Conservatory, reading beside the tall glass panels that overlooked the estate's formal gardens. Her dark hair was gathered loosely, and she wore a simple morning dress that somehow made the surrounding opulence of Blackthorne Castle look vulgar by comparison. "You attended Lady Whitmore's supper," he said from the doorway. Serafina did not look up from her book. "I did. 3 events in 14 days featuring the same guest." Now she looked up. Her dark eyes carried an expression Lucien could never quite categorize. It was not defiance exactly. Defiance implied resistance against acknowledged authority. What Serafina communicated was something more unsettling. The quiet certainty that his authority over her interior life simply did not exist. "If you intend to ask whether I am conducting an affair with Lord Ashbourne," she said calmly, "ask it plainly. I find your surveillance methods insulting enough without adding cowardice to the list." The word cowardice landed like a physical blow. Lucien stepped into the conservatory and closed the door behind him. The glass panels amplified the morning light, turning the room into something between a greenhouse and an interrogation chamber. "I'm not accusing you of anything. No, you are circling, the way you always circle, tightening the perimeter until whatever you are hunting has nowhere left to move." She set the book aside. "I have watched you do it to political rivals, to business partners, to servants who forgot to press your shirts correctly. The method is always identical. The only variable is the target. You are not a target. Then stop aiming." Silence filled the conservatory. Through the glass panels, groundskeepers moved through the formal hedgerows, like slow-moving chess pieces being repositioned by an invisible hand. Lucien pulled a chair from the reading table and sat down across from her. The gesture was unusual enough that Serafina's composure flickered for just a moment. Lucien Ravenscar did not sit at eye level with anyone. He stood. He towered. He occupied the vertical advantage the way predators occupy high ground. Sitting across from her was an act so foreign to his nature that it communicated something words could not. He was afraid. "Cedric Ashbourne is building political alliances against me," he said quietly. "Every dinner he attends, every social function he charms his way through, he is recruiting noble families, military officers, members of Parliament who believed they would breathe easier without my shadow over Westminster. Is that untrue? Serafina asked. Whether it is true or not is irrelevant. What matters is that my wife is being seen in his company during the exact months when proximity to Ashbourne carries political implications that could— Your wife. She repeated the phrase with surgical precision. Your wife is being seen. As though I am a document that has been misplaced. As though the problem is not Cedric's politics, but the optics of your property appearing in the wrong room. That is not what I said. It is exactly what you said. You simply lack the self-awareness to hear it. Lucien's hands tightened on the armrests of the chair. In any other context, with any other human being on Earth, that sentence would have triggered consequences. Ministers had lost their positions for less pointed observations. Business rivals had watched their fortunes evaporate after smaller insults. But Serafina operated outside the framework of punishment and reward that governed every other relationship in his life. He could not punish her without proving her correct. That was her power. And she wielded it with the natural precision of someone who had understood the architecture of his weakness long before he recognized it himself. I am asking you, he said carefully, to consider the political landscape before accepting further invitations. And I am telling you, she replied with equal care, that I will choose my own company based on my own judgment. If that judgment threatens your empire, then perhaps your empire is not as stable as you believe. She stood, collected her book, and walked past him toward the door. As she passed, the fabric of her sleeve brushed against his shoulder. The contact lasted less than a second. But Lucien remained seated for 20 minutes afterward, staring at the empty chair where she had been, feeling the ghost of that accidental touch burn through the layers of wool and linen, as though his skin had forgotten what proximity to another human being felt like when it was not accompanied by transaction. That evening, Blackthorne Castle hosted a political dinner that Lucien had organized 3 weeks earlier. 24 guests occupied the great dining hall beneath a ceiling painted with mythological scenes of conquest and transformation. Silver candelabras threw shifting light across crystal glasses and polished wood. The menu featured 7 courses designed less for pleasure than for demonstrating the obscene wealth that still flowed through Ravenscar coffers, despite parliamentary efforts to dilute it. Lucien presided at the head of the table with the stillness of a man sitting on a throne that everyone else in the room would eventually try to steal. Serafina sat at the opposite end, 18 feet of mahogany and political theater separating them. Cedric Ashbourne had been invited deliberately. It was a strategic decision that Lucien had debated with himself for 2 days before issuing the invitation. The logic was clean. Keep your enemies visible. Let them reveal themselves in controlled environments. A man who believes he is welcomed relaxes his guard, and relaxed guards produce useful intelligence. But the logic fractured the moment Cedric entered the dining hall. He was younger than Lucien by nearly a decade, and that youth carried a quality that had nothing to do with age. Cedric moved through spaces as though the air itself parted willingly for him. His smile arrived without calculation. His laughter emerged from genuine amusement rather than strategic positioning. When he spoke to the elderly Countess of Hartwell, he listened with an attention that made the old woman's face soften in ways Lucien had not witnessed in 30 years of knowing her. And when Cedric reached Serafina's end of the table, the temperature of the entire room shifted. Lucien watched from 18 feet away as his wife engaged in conversation with the man positioning himself to destroy everything the Ravenscar name had built. Serafina's body language carried none of the careful rigidity she maintained around Lucien. Her shoulders relaxed. Her hands moved when she spoke, sketching shapes in the air that gave her words a physical dimension. She laughed once, briefly, at something Cedric said, and the sound traveled the full length of the dining table and struck Lucien in the center of his chest like a bullet fired from close range. He had never made her laugh. In 4 years of marriage, through state dinners and private breakfasts and silent carriage rides through the countryside, Lucien had never produced that sound. He had produced obedience, respect, occasionally admiration for his strategic brilliance, but laughter required something he did not possess and could not acquire through force or negotiation. It required joy. After the 6th course, Lucien excused himself from the table under the pretense of reviewing urgent correspondence. He walked through the castle's darkened corridors until he reached the private armory on the ground floor. The room smelled of gun oil and leather. Weapons lined the walls in precise formations. Swords, pistols, hunting rifles arranged with the obsessive symmetry of a man who found disorder physically painful. He stood in the dark for 7 minutes, breathing. Control was not a personality trait for Lucien Ravenscar. Control was architecture. It was the load-bearing structure that held every other element of his existence in place. Without it, the ceiling collapsed. The walls buckled. The entire edifice of who he was became rubble. And Serafina's laughter was a crack in the foundation. He returned to the dining hall for the 7th course wearing an expression that even Hargrove, standing in the servants' corridor, recognized as dangerous. The conversation had shifted to politics. Lord Pemberton was discussing agricultural reform with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believed crop rotation could solve civil unrest. 2 seats away, a young baronet whose name Lucien had not bothered to learn was arguing about tariff policy with the passionate ignorance that only inherited wealth could produce. Cedric was still near Serafina's end of the table, but now his voice carried across the room, pitched deliberately to reach every ear. The problem with concentrated power, Cedric was saying, is that it requires constant maintenance. Fear is expensive. You have to keep paying for it every single day. Loyalty costs nothing because people give it freely to leaders they actually respect. The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of 24 people simultaneously realizing that someone had just insulted the Duke of Blackthorne inside his own castle. Lucien set down his wine glass. The crystal made a sound against the table that was barely audible, but somehow filled the entire room. "An interesting theory," Lucien said. His voice carried the flat, pleasant neutrality that people who knew him well recognized as the sound preceding destruction. "Tell me, Lord Ashbourne, during your military campaigns, how many soldiers deserted before engagement?" Cedric's smile held. "Fewer than you might imagine." 37. Lucien's silver eyes locked onto Cedric's face across the candlelit expanse. "I read the reports. 37 desertions across 3 campaigns, 12 of them from your personal regiment. Your officers compensated by redistributing duties among remaining troops, which contributed to a 14% increase in casualties during the 3rd engagement." The room had stopped breathing. "Those are selective numbers taken out of—" "Numbers are never selective, Lord Ashbourne. They're simply inconvenient for men who prefer their heroism uncomplicated." Lucien picked up his wine glass again. "Loyalty freely given is also freely withdrawn. That is its fundamental weakness. Fear, on the other hand, does not require the loyalty of the afraid. It only requires their obedience." Cedric held Lucien's stare for 3 full seconds before his gaze dropped to his plate. The concession was microscopic but absolute. Every person at the table registered it. Serafina registered something else entirely. She watched her husband dismantle a decorated war hero with clinical precision and understood, perhaps for the first time since their marriage, that Lucien's cruelty was not a strategy. It was a language, the only language he had ever been taught. Later that night, long after the guests had departed and the servants had cleared the last traces of the evening's theater, Serafina stood in the doorway of Lucien's study. He was reading correspondence by candlelight, and the shadows turned his sharp features into something carved from dark wood. "You humiliated him deliberately," she said. "I corrected a factual misrepresentation. You wanted every person at that table to watch him lose." Lucien looked up from his letters. "He was losing long before I spoke. He simply lacked the awareness to realize it." Serafina stepped into the study. The candlelight caught her eyes and turned them amber. "I want you to hear something, Lucien. Not as the Duke, not as my husband in the legal sense, as a man capable of understanding what I am about to tell you." He waited. "Cedric Ashbourne is not my lover. He is not my confidant. He is not my escape from this marriage." She paused. "But he is proof that another way of existing is possible, that a man can walk into a room and create warmth instead of silence, that power does not require everyone around you to feel small." Her voice softened but did not weaken. "And that is what terrifies you. Not that I might leave, but that I might discover you are not the only version of strength available." She left without waiting for a response. Lucien sat motionless after she was gone. The candle on his desk guttered in a draft from the closing door, throwing his shadow across the wall in a shape that looked, for just a moment, like a man reaching for something he would never be able to hold. 3 days later, he summoned Hargrove at dawn. "Replace the Duchess's personal staff," Lucien ordered. "Every attendant, every maid, every groom assigned to her wing. I want Ravenscar people in every position by Friday." Hargrove's expression did not change. "And the Duchess's correspondence?" "All letters pass through my secretary before delivery, incoming and outgoing." "Her invitations?" "Approved through me personally." Hargrove stood for a moment, and something crossed his face that might have been pity in a man who could still afford such emotions. "Your Grace, the Duchess will recognize these measures immediately." "I know. She will not accept them quietly." "I know that as well." "Then with respect, Your Grace, what outcome are you expecting?" Lucien turned toward the window where the first gray light of morning was spreading across the frozen grounds of Blackthorne like a stain. "Compliance," he said. "Eventually." Hargrove left to carry out his orders. Within 48 hours, Serafina discovered every change. Her new lady's maid was a Ravenscar cousin who reported directly to Hargrove. 2 letters from Lady Whitmore vanished before reaching her writing desk. An invitation to a concert at Belmont Hall was returned without her knowledge. Guards she did not recognize appeared at the entrances to the East Wing with the casual persistence of men who had been instructed to observe without appearing to observe. She said nothing. For 5 days, Serafina moved through Blackthorne Castle as though the walls had not contracted around her. She took breakfast in the conservatory. She walked the frozen gardens in the afternoon. She read in the library. She attended the meals Lucien arranged with the same composed grace she had always carried, offering conversation that was perfectly calibrated to reveal nothing. Lucien watched her silence the way a man watches a fuse burning toward something he cannot see. On the 6th day, Serafina walked into his study without knocking. Her expression carried a quality Lucien had never seen before. Not anger, not resignation, something colder than either. Clarity. "You have turned this castle into a cage," she said. "I have ensured your safety during a period of political instability. You have intercepted my correspondence, replaced my staff with your informants, stationed guards outside my rooms, and you are standing there telling me this is about safety. The political situation is your excuse. It has always been your excuse. Every wall you build around me, every letter you steal, every relationship you suffocate carries the same justification. Safety, protection, duty. But I know what this is, Lucien." She stepped closer. "This is a man who cannot distinguish between love and ownership. You do not understand the threats I am managing. I understand them better than you realize." Her voice dropped to a whisper that carried more force than any shout. "I understand that Cedric Ashbourne is building a coalition against you. I understand that at least 4 noble houses have quietly shifted their parliamentary votes away from your interests in the past 8 months. I understand that Lord Pemberton's intelligence reports have been compromised for at least 6 weeks, which means everything you believe about the current political landscape is built on information your enemies have already designed for you to receive." Lucien's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A recalculation. A machine encountering data that did not fit the existing model. "How do you know this?" he said. It was not a question. "Because I am not the decorative asset you married, Lucien. I never was. You were simply too busy controlling me to notice that I was paying attention." She turned and walked toward the door. Her hand was on the iron handle when Lucien's voice stopped her. "Serafina." She paused but did not turn around. "If what you are telling me is true," he said slowly, "then the threat is far closer than I calculated. And every person inside this castle, including you, is already inside the perimeter of something I may not be able to stop." She looked back over her shoulder. For one moment, something shifted between them. Not warmth, not trust, but the dangerous, unstable recognition that they were standing on the same collapsing ground. "Then perhaps," she said quietly, "you should consider the possibility that the person most qualified to help you survive this is the same person you have spent 4 years trying to imprison." The door closed behind her. Lucien remained standing in the center of his study while the morning light strengthened through the tall windows, illuminating the maps and correspondence and political machinery that had defined every waking hour of his adult life. And for the first time in memory, the Iron Duke of Blackthorne looked at the empire he had constructed and felt something that no amount of power, no depth of control, no fortress of discipline could protect him from. Doubt. 300 miles south, inside a private drawing room in London, Cedric Ashbourne unfolded a letter bearing a seal that Lucien Ravenscar would have recognized instantly. The seal of the second Ravenscar son, Damien. Cedric read the contents twice. Then he walked to the fireplace, burned the letter to ash, and smiled at the flames with the satisfied patience of a man who understood that the most effective weapon against an impenetrable fortress was never a cannon. It was a key already inside the walls. Cedric Ashbourne watched the last fragment of Damien Ravenscar's letter curl into black nothing against the fireplace grate and felt the specific satisfaction of a man who had learned, through years of military command, that patience was not a virtue. Patience was a weapon. The slowest blade cut deepest because the target never saw it coming. He brushed ash from his fingertips, adjusted his cravat in the gilded mirror above the mantel, and returned to the leather chair where a glass of port waited with the loyal stillness of something that would never betray him. London hummed beyond the curtained windows. Carriages rattled across cobblestone. Street vendors called prices into the January cold. Somewhere in Westminster, men with powdered wigs were debating grain tariffs as though the machinery of government still functioned independent of the invisible hands that actually turned its gears. Cedric knew better. Government was theater. Power was backstage. And backstage, the only performance that mattered was the one nobody in the audience could see. He reached into his breast pocket and removed a second document. This one bore no seal, no signature, only a list of names written in Cedric's own careful hand. 14 members of parliament, 6 military officers, 3 newspaper editors. And at the bottom, underlined twice, 2 words that would have made Lucien Ravenscar's blood run cold. Serafina Vale. Not as an ally. Not yet. But as a variable. The one element inside Blackthorne Castle that Lucien could not control, could not predict, and could not sacrifice without destroying the part of himself that was already crumbling. Cedric had watched them together at the dinner. He had watched Lucien's jaw tighten when Serafina laughed. He had watched the Duke's fingers whiten around the stem of his wineglass with the desperate grip of a man holding onto the edge of something that was already falling. And Cedric had understood, with the tactical clarity that made him dangerous, that Lucien Ravenscar's greatest vulnerability was not political. It was personal. A knock came at the drawing room door. Cedric folded the list and returned it to his pocket before answering. "Come." The door opened to reveal a man Cedric had not expected for another 3 days. Colonel Marcus Hale stood in the doorway wearing civilian clothes that fit him like a disguise he resented. Hale was 41, scarred across the left temple from a musket ball that had grazed him during the same campaign where Cedric earned his medals, and his eyes carried the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many years looking at horizons for threats that usually arrived from behind. "You are early," Cedric said. Damien moved the timeline. Hale closed the door and remained standing. He never sat in rooms that were not his own, another survival instinct from the field. The northern garrisons are rotating next month instead of March. If Ravenscar's military contacts in Yorkshire are going to be isolated, it has to happen before the new companies arrive. How many officers have we confirmed? 6, possibly 7. General Thornbury is still hesitating. Thornbury always hesitates. That is why he survived 3 wars and never won any of them. Cedric set down his port glass. What about Parliament? Pemberton is compromised. Cedric's expression shifted by exactly 1 degree. To anyone unfamiliar with his face, nothing had changed. But Hale had served beside him for 9 years and recognized the specific tightening around his eyes that preceded recalculation. Compromised how? Ravenscar intercepted his last intelligence packet, the one containing our meeting schedule for February. Hale paused. Which means the Duke now knows we have been coordinating through Pemberton's office. He does not yet know the full scope, but he knows the channel exists. When did this happen? 48 hours ago. Damien confirmed it through his contact inside Blackthorne's household staff. Cedric stood and walked to the window. He drew the curtain aside 1 inch and looked down at the London street below, where the ordinary machinery of civilian life continued operating in cheerful ignorance of the political demolition being engineered above their heads. Pemberton is burned, Cedric said flatly. Cut all communication through his office. Redirect intelligence through Lady Whitmore's charitable network. And Pemberton himself? Leave him in place. A man who does not know he has been abandoned still behaves naturally. Let Ravenscar watch him. Let the Duke waste resources monitoring a channel that is already dead. Hale nodded. It was the kind of decision that separated men who studied war from men who understood it. You did not remove a compromised asset. You left it visible. You let the enemy invest attention in something that no longer mattered, while the real operation moved through doors they were not watching. There is one more thing, Hale said. Damien wants a meeting, face-to-face, before the masquerade at Wintermere. Where? He suggested the old Ravenscar hunting lodge near the border, neutral ground. He says he has information about Lucien's military preparations that cannot be committed to paper. Damien says many things. Cedric turned from the window. The question is whether his hatred for his brother is strong enough to sustain the risk he is taking. Betraying Lucien Ravenscar is not a political maneuver. It is a death sentence with a delayed execution date. You think he will lose his nerve? I think Damien Ravenscar has spent his entire life standing in the shadow of a man who made him feel insufficient. That kind of wound does not heal. It calcifies. It becomes the bone structure of everything a man does for the rest of his life. Cedric picked up his port glass again and studied the dark liquid as though it contained something worth reading. He will not lose his nerve. He will do something worse. He will overreach. Men driven by humiliation always do. 300 miles north, inside the frozen architecture of Blackthorne Castle, the object of Cedric's tactical calculations was sitting alone in her private chambers, counting the ways her world had contracted. Serafina had discovered the 4th surveillance measure that morning. A new footman stationed at the garden entrance, young enough to appear unremarkable, but positioned with the deliberate sightlines of someone trained in observation rather than service. He held doors with his left hand, which meant his right remained free. A military habit. Lucien was not merely watching her. He was assigning soldiers. She stood before the window of her dressing room and pressed her fingertips against the frozen glass until the cold bit into her skin. The sensation grounded her. Pain was honest. Pain did not pretend to be something else. Unlike everything else inside this castle, pain did not arrive wearing the mask of protection. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass. She looked for fear and did not find it. What she found instead was the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 4 years translating a man's damage into a language she could survive. Lucien did not love her. She had understood that within the first month of their marriage. What he felt was something more primitive and far more dangerous. He needed her the way a drowning man needs the surface of the water. Not because the surface is beautiful, not because the surface has value in itself, but because without it, the alternative is suffocation. And a drowning man does not hold gently. A drowning man grips with the kind of force that drags whatever he touches down with him. A knock interrupted her thoughts. The new lady's maid, Margaret, entered with a breakfast tray arranged with the careful precision of someone performing a task that was secondary to her actual assignment. "Good morning, Your Grace. Shall I open the curtains?" "They are already open." "Of course. My apologies." Margaret set the tray on the writing desk and lingered 1 beat too long, eyes moving across the room's surfaces with the quick inventory of someone memorizing details for a later report. "Margaret." "Yes, Your Grace?" "When you report to Hargrove this evening, you may inform him that I spent the morning reading and that nothing of interest occurred. It will save you the trouble of inventing details." Margaret's face went pale. Her hand stilled against the tea service. "I do not report to—" "You were hired 11 days ago from the Ravenscar estate in Dorset. Your mother served the Ravenscar household for 23 years. You were recommended personally by Hargrove, and you deliver a written summary of my daily activities to his office every evening before supper." Serafina picked up the teacup without looking at the woman. "I do not hold this against you. Loyalty to the family that raised you is not a character flaw, but please do not insult us both by denying it." Margaret stood frozen for several seconds. Then, without another word, she curtsied and left the room. Serafina sipped the tea. It was Earl Grey, prepared exactly the way she preferred. Even Lucien's surveillance was meticulous. He had ensured that the woman assigned to spy on her knew her tea preferences, as though comfort and captivity could coexist without contradiction, as though the cage could be made acceptable by gilding the bars. She set down the cup and opened the bottom drawer of her writing desk. Beneath a stack of embroidery patterns that no one would think to examine, she retrieved a small leather notebook. Inside it, written in a shorthand she had invented during her first year at Blackthorne, was everything she had learned about her husband's political operation: supply lines, parliamentary leverage points, financial dependencies, the names of 17 men whose loyalty to Lucien was purchased rather than earned, and the specific prices that had been paid. She had assembled this intelligence not through espionage, but through observation. Through 4 years of sitting at dinner tables where powerful men spoke freely because they assumed the woman at the end of the table was decorative. Through reading documents left visible on desks by a husband who never imagined she would understand what she was looking at. Lucien's greatest strategic error was not his cruelty. It was his certainty that the people he controlled lacked the capacity to outthink him. She turned to the most recent entry, a name she had added 3 days ago after overhearing a conversation between Hargrove and a courier in the service corridor: Lucien Ravenscar. Lucien's younger brother had visited Blackthorne exactly once during their marriage, a Christmas gathering 2 years ago during which Damien had performed the role of devoted sibling with a technical competence that Serafina recognized immediately because she spent every day performing a similar role herself. Damien smiled at his brother's jokes, deferred to his opinions, occupied the position of lesser son with practiced ease. But Serafina had watched Damien's eyes during the moments when Lucien's attention was directed elsewhere, and what she saw in those unguarded seconds was not admiration or resentment. It was measurement. Damien was measuring his brother the way an engineer measures a structure, looking for the load-bearing points, the stress fractures, the specific locations where carefully applied pressure would cause maximum collapse. She closed the notebook and returned it to its hiding place beneath the embroidery patterns. Then she sat very still and made a decision that she understood, even as she made it, would change the trajectory of everything. She would not warn Lucien, not because she wanted him to fall, not because she had allied herself with his enemies, but because Lucien Ravenscar would never willingly dismantle the machinery of control he had built around her life. He would never release his grip. He would never recognize that the woman he had married was not territory to be defended, but a person whose freedom was not his to grant or withhold. The only thing that could break the cage was the same thing that would break the man who built it, and Serafina had decided she could survive the wreckage. That afternoon, Lucien summoned his war council. The term was unofficial. Officially, the 8 men gathered in the castle's lower study were political advisors, estate managers, and legal counsel. Unofficially, they were the operational infrastructure of the most powerful private political machine in England, and they understood without being told that the room they occupied existed in no official record, and the conversations conducted within it would never be acknowledged. Lucien stood before the fireplace, backlit by flames that threw his shadow across the table where his advisors sat in careful silence. He had not slept. The skin beneath his eyes carried the bruised translucency of exhaustion, but his voice remained the flat, calibrated instrument that these men had learned to interpret the way sailors interpret barometric readings. "Pemberton is compromised," Lucien began. "His intelligence channel has been feeding coordinated misinformation for at least 6 weeks. Every assessment we have received about Ashbourne's parliamentary coalition during that period should be considered unreliable." The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. These men were too experienced for surprise. It was the silence of professionals rapidly recalculating. Sir William Mercer, Lucien's chief legal strategist, spoke first. "If Pemberton's channel is burned, Ashbourne knows we were monitoring through his office, which means Ashbourne has already relocated his coordination to a channel we have not yet identified, yes." "Do we know the source of the compromise?" "Not yet." Lucien's eyes moved across each face at the table with the systematic attention of a man searching for something specific. but the timing suggests internal access. Someone close enough to our operation to know which channels we were using and positioned well enough to redirect Ashbourne's communication without triggering our verification protocols. Internal. Mercer repeated the word as though testing its weight. You are suggesting a traitor inside the Ravenscar network. I am not suggesting anything. I am describing a mathematical probability. Lucien placed both hands flat on the table. Ashbourne is a competent tactician, but he does not have the operational intelligence to penetrate our network independently. He has help, someone who understands our structure from the inside. That narrows the field considerably, said Colonel Graves, Lucien's military liaison. Fewer than a dozen people have sufficient knowledge of our intelligence protocols to exploit them. Fewer than a dozen, Lucien straightened. I want every one of them identified, monitored, and subjected to a full audit of their communications over the past 4 months. Personal correspondence included. All of them, including senior household staff? Everyone, Colonel. Trust is a commodity I can no longer afford to distribute freely. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Strategies were debated, contingencies mapped, vulnerabilities catalogued. But beneath the operational machinery, something else was happening inside Lucien's mind, a process he could not control and could not stop. He was thinking about Serafina's words. The person most qualified to help you survive this is the same person you have spent 4 years trying to imprison. The statement was either the most dangerous manipulation he had ever encountered or the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a decade. And the fact that he could not determine which possibility was correct terrified him more than any political conspiracy. Because Lucien Ravenscar had built his entire existence on the ability to distinguish truth from deception. That ability was the foundation beneath every other structure. And Serafina had somehow positioned herself in the exact space where his instruments of measurement failed. He could not read her. He had never been able to read her. And a man who could not read the person closest to him was a man standing on ground that might already be hollow. The council dispersed at dusk. Lucien walked the castle's corridors alone, his footsteps echoing off stone walls that had absorbed 3 centuries of Ravenscar ambition, Ravenscar cruelty, and Ravenscar silence. He passed through the portrait gallery where his ancestors stared down from oil canvases with the same silver eyes he saw every morning in his own mirror. Hard men. Calculating men. Men who understood that the world was a mechanism designed to crush anyone too slow or too soft to keep the gears turning in their favor. His father's portrait occupied the central position. Edmund Ravenscar, the 4th Duke of Blackthorne, who had taught his eldest son 2 lessons that defined everything that followed. First, strength is the only currency that never devalues. Second, the moment you need someone is the moment they own you. Lucien stood beneath his father's painted gaze and felt the second lesson pressing against the inside of his chest like something trying to break through bone. He needed Serafina. Not her intelligence, although she had revealed that morning that her intelligence exceeded his estimates by a margin that should have embarrassed him. Not her political connections, although those connections operated through social networks he could never access. He needed something he could not name and could not quantify, and could not acquire through any mechanism of force or transaction. He needed her to choose him. And a man whose entire philosophy was built on the principle that choice was weakness could not reconcile that need without dismantling himself. He found her in the library after nightfall. She was standing beside the tall windows where moonlight cut silver lines across the darkened shelves. She had been crying. He could see it in the slight reddening around her eyes, the careful way she held her face composed, the fractional stiffness in her breathing that revealed the effort required to maintain her posture. He had never seen her cry before. The discovery produced a sensation in his chest that he did not recognize and did not know how to process. It was not guilt exactly. Guilt implied acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and Lucien had not yet arrived at that particular destination. It was something adjacent, something preliminary. The architectural equivalent of noticing a crack in a wall and understanding that the crack meant something without yet understanding what. I have removed the guard from the garden entrance, he said. Serafina did not turn from the window. And the others? They remain. Then nothing has changed. One thing has changed. Now she turned. The moonlight caught the tracks of moisture on her face and turned them silver. "I am asking for your help," Lucien said. The words came out with the physical difficulty of a man speaking a language he had never practiced. Not commanding, not negotiating, asking. The silence between them stretched across the dark library like something alive and fragile and terrible. "You do not know how to ask," she said finally. "You know how to demand while using the vocabulary of asking. There is a difference." "Then teach me the difference." "I cannot teach a man something he refuses to learn. I am not refusing." "You are standing in a room where you stationed guards to watch me and telling me you are not refusing." Her voice did not rise. It dropped, and the drop was worse. "Every word you speak about trust and openness comes from the same mouth that ordered my letters intercepted. Do you understand how that sounds? Do you have any idea what it costs to stand in front of a man who controls every door in your life and listen to him talk about asking?" Lucien did not answer, not because he lacked words, but because the words he had were inadequate for the first time in his life, and a man who had weaponized language since childhood did not know how to function when his primary weapon misfired. "Remove the guards," Serafina said. "All of them. Restore my correspondence. Dismiss the staff you planted in my household, and do it not because it is strategically advantageous. Do it because it is right." "And if I do?" "Then we will see if the man underneath the Duke is someone I can recognize." She walked past him toward the door. As she moved through the darkness between the shelves, her hand brushed against his sleeve. The contact was so brief it might have been accidental, but Lucien felt it travel through the fabric and settle somewhere beneath his ribs like a splinter working deeper into wood. He did not remove the guards, not because he chose not to, but because the part of him capable of releasing control had been dead so long he no longer knew where it was buried. And 200 miles south, in a hunting lodge that smelled of wood smoke and old leather, Lucien Ravenscar unfolded a map of Blackthorne Castle across a rough oak table and placed his finger on the east wing corridor where his brother's wife slept behind doors that were watched, but never locked. "The masquerade at Wintermere is in 19 days, Damien said to the 3 men gathered around the table. "By the 20th day, my brother will no longer control anything worth controlling." He looked up from the map with eyes that matched Lucien's perfectly in color and carried nothing of his brother in their warmth. "And the Duchess?" Damien smiled. It was the smile of a man who had spent decades studying the specific architecture of another man's weakness and had finally identified the single stone whose removal would bring the entire structure down. "The Duchess," Damien said, "is the key to everything. 19 days disappeared like ammunition spent against a target that refused to fall. Lucien Ravenscar spent each of those days inside the operational machinery of Blackthorne Castle, tightening defenses he believed were impenetrable while the real threat moved through channels he never thought to monitor. He audited Pemberton's compromised intelligence network. He repositioned military contacts across Yorkshire. He reviewed financial ledgers, scrutinized parliamentary voting records, and conducted interrogations of minor operatives so thorough that 2 of them confessed to disloyalties they had not yet committed simply because the pressure of Lucien's attention made future betrayal feel like a crime already completed. He found nothing. The absence of evidence should have alarmed him. In Lucien's experience, clean intelligence was dirty intelligence that had been laundered. A network producing no anomalies was a network where the anomalies had been professionally removed. But the Duke's attention was fractured in ways he refused to acknowledge, split between the political threat gathering on his borders and the woman who moved through his castle with the unbearable composure of someone who had already decided how this story would end. Serafina had not spoken to him since the library. 7 days of silence. She appeared at meals. She walked the gardens. She sat in the conservatory with books she turned pages of without reading, performing the choreography of a normal life with the precision of an actress who despised the production but refused to break character. When their eyes met across dining tables or corridors, hers carried the flat, measuring quality of a woman who had asked one clear question and received the only answer she needed. He had not removed the guards. The decision haunted him with the persistence of a wound that would not close. Every morning he woke intending to issue the order. Every morning the machinery of control reasserted itself with the mechanical certainty of gears that had been turning too long to stop without catastrophic structural failure. Releasing surveillance meant accepting vulnerability. Accepting vulnerability meant trusting someone. And trust, in the architecture of Lucien Ravenscar's mind, was not a bridge between two people. It was a hole in a fortification wall. His father's voice lived inside that architecture like load-bearing steel. The moment you need someone is the moment they own you. And so the guards remained. And so the silence deepened. And so the distance between Lucien and the one person who might have saved him widened into a gap that no amount of power could cross. On the 18th day, Hargrove delivered a sealed envelope to Lucien's study. The paper was expensive. The handwriting was familiar. The seal belonged to the Crown's Master of Ceremonies, an invitation to the royal masquerade at Wintermere Palace. Lucien turned the envelope in his hands. Wintermere was Crown territory. Attending meant entering a space where his private military meant nothing, where the political rules were set by men who had been quietly distancing themselves from Ravenscar influence for months. Every instinct told him the invitation was a trap, but refusing would signal weakness to every noble house watching for signs that the Iron Duke's grip was loosening. He could not afford weakness. Not now. "Confirm attendance," Lucien told Hargrove. "For 2. "The Duchess as well, Your Grace?" "The Duchess as well." Hargrove hesitated at the door. "May I speak candidly, Your Grace?" "You have served this house for 40 years, Hargrove. If you have not earned candor by now, neither of us has been paying attention. Lady Seraphina has not spoken to you in 7 days. Taking her to Wintermere under these conditions may produce complications that— Complications are what I manage, Hargrove. It is the only thing I have ever been good at." Lucien set the invitation down. "Prepare the carriage for tomorrow evening." The old steward left without further argument, carrying with him the private certainty that his master was walking towards something that management alone could not survive. The journey to Wintermere took 9 hours through frozen English countryside that looked, beneath the January moon, like a kingdom already conquered by something cold and indifferent to human ambition. Lucien and Seraphina shared the carriage in a silence so complete that the horse's breathing and the creak of wooden axles became the only evidence that time was still passing. Lucien sat facing forward. Seraphina sat facing backward. The arrangement was not accidental. She had chosen the rear-facing seat before he entered the carriage, positioning herself so that watching the road ahead required looking past him rather than at him. A minor geographical rebellion. But Lucien understood spatial language the way musicians understood key signatures, and the message was unmistakable. She was done looking in his direction. Halfway through the journey, somewhere in the black expanse between county borders, Seraphina broke the silence with a voice that carried no warmth and no hostility. Only information. "Damien will be at Wintermere." Lucien's eyes moved from the window to her face. "How do you know that?" "Because I pay attention to things you consider beneath your notice. Your brother's valet purchased formal attire from Maddox & Sons in London 4 days ago. Wintermere appropriate. Full evening dress with military decorations. Damien has attended court functions before. His presence is not unusual." "His presence is always unusual. You simply choose not to see it because acknowledging that your brother might be dangerous would require admitting that your judgment about family was wrong. And you do not make errors. That is the mythology you have built, and mythologies are very expensive to maintain." Lucien studied her face in the dim carriage light. Shadows moved across her features as the vehicle swayed, making her expression difficult to read. But her eyes were steady. The eyes of a woman delivering intelligence she had no obligation to share. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because what happens at Wintermere will happen regardless of whether you are prepared. And despite everything you have done to me inside that castle, I am not yet willing to watch you walk into destruction without warning." She paused. "Consider it the last act of a wife who still remembers the difference between a man and the monster he has chosen to become." The carriage continued through the darkness. Neither spoke again. Wintermere Palace materialized out of the frozen night like a hallucination of wealth and imperial excess. Thousands of candles blazed behind tall windows, throwing golden light across snow-covered lawns where carriages lined the drive in a procession of lacquered wood and brass. Music poured through the open entrance hall, a full orchestra performing something triumphant and vaguely martial beneath ceilings painted with allegorical scenes of British conquest. The masquerade was the Crown's annual display of ceremonial unity, a night when every noble house in England gathered beneath the same roof to demonstrate through elaborate costumes and careful choreography, that the ruling class was a cohesive organism rather than a collection of competing predators wearing identical dinner clothes. Lucien entered wearing a black mask that covered the upper half of his face and changed nothing about the way people recognized him. His height, his posture, the specific quality of stillness that surrounded him like a temperature drop. Guests moved aside as he passed through the entrance hall, not dramatically, not with visible fear, with the subtle, practiced instinct of people who had learned that proximity to Lucien Ravenscar carried costs that were difficult to predict and impossible to reverse. Serafina walked beside him in a gown of deep burgundy silk, her mask a delicate construction of dark lace that made her eyes appear larger and more dangerous than usual. She moved through the crowd with her hand resting on Lucien's arm, and the contact felt to both of them like a performance so convincing that neither could remember where the acting ended and the truth began. The ballroom was a cathedral of gilt and crystal. Chandeliers hung like frozen explosions of light above a marble floor where 300 guests circulated in masks that ranged from subtle to grotesque. The air smelled of perfume, champagne, candle wax, and the faint electrical charge that accompanies rooms where powerful people are lying to each other simultaneously. Lucien catalogued threats the way he always did, automatically, continuously. The Duke of Westerfield standing near the East Colonnade with two parliamentary allies who had voted against Ravenscar interests last session. Lady Ashmore whispering to a newspaper editor whose recent columns had been unusually critical of northern aristocratic influence. A cluster of military officers near the refreshment tables, whose regimental affiliations placed them firmly in Ashbourne's orbit. And there, moving through the crowd with the effortless warmth that made him dangerous, Cedric Ashbourne. Silver mask, white military dress uniform, surrounded by admirers who gravitated toward him with the helpless attraction of objects falling toward something with greater mass. Cedric's eyes found Lucien across the ballroom. The two men held each other's gaze for 3 seconds. Cedric smiled behind his mask. It was not a challenge. It was worse. It was the relaxed expression of a man who no longer considered his opponent surprising. Lucien felt the muscles along his jaw tighten. His fingers pressed harder against Serafina's hand where it rested on his arm. She did not pull away, but she felt the pressure increase and understood, as she always understood, exactly what was happening beneath the surface of his composure. He was losing control. Not visibly. Not yet. The mask held. The posture held. The carefully constructed exterior of aristocratic authority held the way a dam holds against rising water. But the pressure behind it was building with a velocity that structural engineering alone could not contain. "Do not," Serafina whispered without moving her lips. "Not here. I am perfectly composed." "You are perfectly murderous. There is a difference. And every person in this room who matters can see it." She released his arm and moved into the crowd, leaving Lucien standing alone near the entrance to the ballroom with the sudden disorienting sensation of a man who had been leaning against something that was no longer there. The next 40 minutes unfolded with the grinding inevitability of machinery that has already been set in motion. Lucien circulated through the masquerade, engaging in conversations that required portions of his attention while the rest tracked Serafina's movement through the ballroom with the obsessive precision of a compass needle locked onto magnetic north. She spoke to Lady Whitmore near the orchestra. She accepted champagne from a footman. She paused beside a group of women whose laughter carried across the room with the carefree brightness of people who did not live inside cages built by the men who claimed to love them. And then Cedric appeared beside her. Lucien watched from across the room as Ashbourne leaned close to Serafina's ear. The crowd noise made their conversation inaudible, but Lucien could read the geometry of their interaction. The angle of Cedric's head, the slight forward tilt of Serafina's body that indicated active listening rather than polite tolerance. The way her hand moved to her throat in a gesture that Lucien had catalogued during 4 years of marriage as the physical signature of genuine emotional response. Something Cedric said made her turn sharply. Her composure cracked for just a moment. Her eyes widened behind the dark lace mask. Then she recovered, glanced across the ballroom toward Lucien, and the look that passed between husband and wife carried a weight that made the surrounding spectacle of aristocratic theater feel like tissue paper wrapped around a bomb. Lucien crossed the ballroom floor. The crowd parted. They always parted, but tonight the parting carried a different quality, not deference, anticipation. 300 masked faces turning toward the point of convergence, like spectators at an event they had been told to expect. He reached Seraphina and Cedric in 12 strides. "Lord Ashbourne." Lucien's voice carried the flat neutrality that preceded violence the way silence precedes thunder. "I believe you are speaking to my wife." Cedric straightened. His silver mask caught the chandelier light. "I was offering the Duchess my compliments on her gown. Is that still permitted in your kingdom, your grace?" "Your compliments have been noted. You may deliver them from a greater distance." "Lucien," Seraphina's voice cut between them, low, controlled, carrying the specific frequency of a woman who understood that the next 30 seconds would determine the trajectory of hundreds of lives. "We should dance." She placed her hand on his arm. The gesture was calculated, not affection, but redirection, the physical equivalent of steering a loaded weapon away from a crowd. Lucien looked at her hand on his arm, then at Cedric's face, then back at her hand. He allowed himself to be led to the dance floor. The orchestra was playing a waltz. Lucien held Seraphina at the prescribed distance, his hand at her waist, her hand on his shoulder, and they moved through the patterns with the mechanical precision of two people performing a ritual that no longer contained any of the meaning it was designed to express. "What did he say to you?" Lucien said. "That is not your concern." "Everything about you is my concern. Everything about me is your obsession. Those are different things, Lucien, and the fact that you cannot tell them apart is why we are standing on a dance floor while your empire burns around you." "My empire is not burning. Your empire has been burning for months. You have simply been too busy watching me to notice the smoke." The waltz turned them through the center of the floor. Other couples moved around them like planets orbiting something gravitationally unstable. Lucien's hand tightened at her waist, not painfully, but with the specific pressure of a man who was holding on because releasing felt identical to dying. "He told you something," Lucien said. "Something that changed your expression. I saw it from across the room. Tell me what it was." Seraphina looked up at him. Behind the lace mask, her dark eyes held something he had never seen directed at him before. Not anger, not contempt, not the careful diplomatic neutrality she had maintained for 4 years. Pity. "He told me about Damien," she said quietly. The waltz continued. Lucien's feet kept moving. His posture remained correct. But inside the architecture of his composure, something fundamental shifted. A bearing wall cracked. A foundation settled in a direction it was never designed to move. "What about Damien?" "That your brother has been coordinating with Ashbourne's coalition for over a year. That the compromised intelligence through Pemberton was not Cedric's operation. It was Damien's. That every move you have made in the past 6 months has been anticipated, channeled, and redirected by someone who knows your strategies because he learned them at the same table where you learned yours." Lucien stopped dancing. They stood motionless in the center of the ballroom while couples flowed around them like water parting around stone. The orchestra played on. The candles burned. The masquerade continued its glittering performance of civilized unity, while Lucien Ravenscar processed the single piece of information that his entire operational framework had been designed never to encounter. Betrayal from inside the bloodline. He had planned for parliamentary opposition. He had planned for military challenges. He had planned for economic warfare, intelligence failures, diplomatic isolation, and every conceivable form of external threat that a man in his position might face. But he had never built defenses against Damien because Damien was not external. Damien was structural. Damien was part of the building itself. And you cannot fortify a wall against the crack that already lives inside it. "How long have you known?" Lucien said. His voice sounded unfamiliar to his own ears, stripped, reduced to raw frequency without the harmonic layers of authority and control that normally gave it weight. "I suspected for months. I confirmed it 3 weeks ago through your own household intelligence that you never thought to share with me. And you did not tell me. I told you in the library. I told you the threat was closer than you calculated. I told you the person most qualified to help you survive was the person you were imprisoning. You responded by keeping the guards at my doors." Her eyes did not waver. You chose control over information, Lucien. That is not my failure. That is yours. The waltz ended. Applause scattered through the ballroom. Lucien stood in the center of the marble floor while the world he had constructed rearranged itself around a new and devastating axis. He released Serafina's hand and walked toward the east colonnade with the rigid gait of a man moving through physical space while his internal geography collapsed. Guests stepped aside. Conversations paused. The specific quality of his movement communicated something that even people who did not know him well could interpret. Something had broken. He reached the colonnade and leaned against a marble pillar, pressing his shoulder into the cold stone, as though the solidity of the material could substitute for the solidity he had just lost. His breathing was controlled but shallow. His hands hung at his sides, and for the first time in his adult life, they were shaking. Damien, his brother, his blood. The boy he had watched grow up inside the same cold corridors of Blackthorne Castle, learning the same lessons from the same merciless father, absorbing the same philosophy of strength and dominance that had shaped them both into instruments of acquisition. Lucien had believed Damien accepted his position as the lesser son the way younger sons always accepted it, with quiet resentment that eventually matured into pragmatic cooperation. He had given Damien responsibilities, trusted him with peripheral operations, allowed him access to the family's strategic infrastructure because excluding blood from blood was a form of weakness that their father would have considered unforgivable. And Damien had used every piece of access like a cartographer mapping the interior of a fortress he intended to destroy. The colonnade was cold. January air poured through the open archways, carrying snowflakes that melted against the marble floor like small white casualties. Lucien pressed his back against the pillar and closed his eyes. Behind the darkness of his eyelids, the machinery of his mind was doing something it had never done before. It was not calculating, it was not strategizing, it was not building contingency frameworks or identifying leverage points or mapping the operational landscape toward optimal outcomes. It was simply sitting inside the wreckage and feeling what wreckage felt like. His father had never taught him this. Edmund Ravenscar's pedagogy contained no module for processing betrayal by someone you were supposed to be able to trust without question. There was no protocol, no procedure, just the raw, unmediated experience of discovering that the ground you built your life on was hollow, and that the hollowing had been done by hands you never thought to watch. Footsteps approached across the colonnade. Lucien opened his eyes, expecting Serafina. Instead, he found Damien. His brother stood 10 feet away wearing a dark blue evening coat and a mask he had already removed, holding it loosely at his side like a prop from a play he no longer needed to perform. Damien was shorter than Lucien by 2 inches and lighter by 20 pounds, with the same silver eyes set in a face that carried less severity and more adaptability. Where Lucien's features communicated authority, Damien's communicated approachability. It was the perfect camouflage for a man whose actual intentions were anything but approachable. "You look unwell, brother," Damien said. Lucien studied his brother's face with the desperate attention of a man searching for evidence he had missed. Signs, warnings, the micro-expressions of deception that should have been visible during years of family dinners and estate meetings and private conversations where Damien had presumably been cataloging weaknesses while performing loyalty. He found nothing. Damien's face was perfectly composed, the face of a man who had been lying for so long that the lie had become structurally identical to the truth. "You have been busy," Lucien said. "I'm always busy. You taught me that. Idle hands and empty hours are luxuries that Ravenscars cannot afford." Damien stepped closer. "You seem troubled. Is the masquerade not to your liking?" "Drop the performance, Damien." Something shifted behind Damien's eyes. A recalibration. The subtle tightening of muscles around the jaw that indicated a man reassessing how much of his cover had been compromised. "I am not sure what performance you are referring to." "The one where you play the loyal younger brother while feeding my operational intelligence to Cedric Ashbourne. The one where you use Pemberton's network to redirect misinformation into my war council. The one you have been rehearsing for a year while I was too busy controlling my wife to notice my brother dismantling my empire from the inside." The colonnade went quiet. Snow fell through the archways in slow, diagonal lines. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra launched into something bright and celebratory that sounded, From this distance, like music playing in a burning building, Damien's composure held for 4 seconds. Then it dissolved. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a man caught in a lie, with the slow, deliberate release of a man setting down a weight he was tired of carrying. "Took you long enough," Damien said softly. "How long?" 14 months, give or take." "Why?" Damien laughed. The sound was short and carried no humor. "Why? You are actually asking me why." He stepped forward until less than 5 feet separated them. "Because you took everything, Lucien, every opportunity, every connection, every scrap of influence that our family name could generate, you consumed it and called it leadership. You left me the margins, the peripheral operations, the work that was necessary but never important enough to threaten your position at the center. I gave you responsibilities appropriate to... You gave me a leash and called it responsibility. You gave me enough room to be useful, but never enough to be dangerous. And you did it with such precision that I spent years believing it was generosity before I understood it was containment." Damien's voice hardened. "You contained me the way you contain everything, the way you contain her." The reference to Serafina hit Lucien like a fist against a bruise. Serafina has nothing to do with this. Serafina has everything to do with this. She is the proof that your methodology does not work. You can control territories. You can control markets. You can control parliament. But you cannot control a person without destroying the thing that made them worth controlling in the first place. Damien's silver eyes locked onto Lucien's with an intensity that was not hatred. It was something older and more corrosive. "I watched you do it to her, Lucien, and I recognized the process because you had already done it to me." Lucien felt something moving through his chest that he had no framework to process. Not rage, not grief. Something beneath both. Something foundational shifting like tectonic plates grinding against each other in the dark. "So you destroy everything," Lucien said. "The dynasty, the name, 400 years of Ravenscar legacy. To punish me." "Not to punish you, to replace you." Damien's voice dropped to a whisper. "By tomorrow morning, Ashbourne's coalition will present articles of condemnation to Parliament. Your military contacts in the north will receive orders transferring them to colonial postings. Your financial instruments will be frozen pending investigation. And every noble house that has been waiting for permission to turn against you will receive it simultaneously." He paused. "It is elegant, Lucien. You would appreciate the architecture if it were not aimed at you." The snow was falling harder now. White accumulation gathered on the colonnade floor between them. Inside the ballroom, the masquerade continued its performance of aristocratic civilization, 300 people dancing and drinking and lying to each other with varying degrees of skill while 2 brothers stood in the cold and watched the family legacy they shared begin its final collapse. "You will not survive this either," Lucien said quietly. "Whatever you think Ashbourne has promised you, you are a tool to him. When my empire falls, he will discard you the way you discard any instrument that has served its purpose. Perhaps, but I would rather be discarded by someone who defeated me than suffocated by someone who claimed to love me." Damien turned and walked back toward the ballroom. His footsteps left dark impressions in the thin layer of snow covering the marble. Lucien watched his brother's silhouette merge with the golden light pouring through the ballroom doors and disappear into the crowd. He stood alone in the colonnade for a long time after that. The cold worked through his evening coat and into his muscles and down toward bone. His hands had stopped shaking. They had gone still with the specific immobility of someone who has received information so fundamentally destabilizing that the body's emergency systems have suspended all non-essential functions to redirect energy toward survival. Survival. The word arrived in his mind with a clarity that cut through the noise of everything else. Not empire, not legacy, not dynasty, not the political architecture he had spent his entire adult life constructing. Survival. The most primitive calculation, the one that existed before titles and territories and the elaborate fictions of aristocratic power. He was going to lose everything. The realization settled into him, not like a revelation but like a diagnosis, clinical, specific, final. Damien's operation was already in motion. The parliamentary coalition was assembled. The military transfers were prepared. The financial instruments were targeted. Every structural element of Lucien's power was going to be systematically dismantled by morning, and there was nothing the machinery of control could do to stop it, because the machinery of control was the thing being dismantled. The only question that remained was what a man became when everything he had built to define himself was taken away. Lucien walked back into the ballroom. The warmth hit him like a wall. Music, perfume, candlelight, the murmur of 300 conversations conducted through masks and lies, and the fragile agreements that held civilization together through mutual pretense. He moved through the crowd without seeing faces, without cataloging threats, without performing the automatic surveillance that had defined his interaction with every public space for 2 decades. He was looking for Serafina. He found her near the tall windows on the western wall, standing alone with a glass of champagne she had not touched. The masquerade swirled around her like weather around something stationary. Her dark lace mask was pushed up onto her forehead, revealing her full face, and the expression she wore was the expression of a woman who was waiting for something she had already seen coming. She watched him approach, read his face, understood. "He told you," she said. "He told me everything." And now? Lucien stood before her while the masquerade performed its final act of denial around them. Tomorrow, cannons. Tomorrow, parliamentary condemnation. Tomorrow, the Iron Duke's empire turned to rubble and ash and historical footnotes about the dangers of concentrated power. But tonight, standing in front of the woman he had tried to own and failed to love, and was about to lose along with everything else, Lucien Ravenscar felt the last structural wall inside himself begin to give way. "Now," he said, and his voice cracked on the word like ice breaking under weight it was never designed to carry. "I need to become someone I do not know how to be." Across the ballroom, Cedric Ashbourne raised a glass of champagne to Damien Ravenscar. The 2 men locked eyes across the golden, glittering distance. And in the orchestra pit, the conductor raised his baton for the final waltz of the evening, while outside, beyond the candlelit windows, the snow began falling with the silent, implacable patience of something that intended to bury everything. The snow had not stopped falling when Lucien seized Serafina's hand and pulled her through the ballroom toward the service corridor behind the orchestra pit. She did not resist. She did not ask where they were going. The pressure of his grip communicated everything language could not. This was not possession. This was a man reaching for the only solid thing left in a room where the floor was disappearing. They moved through narrow servant passages lit by oil lamps that threw their shadows in elongated shapes against whitewashed walls. The sounds of the masquerade faded behind them, the orchestra's final waltz becoming a distant vibration felt through stone rather than heard through air. Kitchen staff pressed against walls as they passed. A footman carrying a tray of crystal glasses froze mid-stride, eyes wide, recognizing the Duke of Blackthorne moving through spaces no duke had ever used with the hunted velocity of a man whose geography had fundamentally changed. Lucien found an empty pantry at the end of the corridor. He pulled Serafina inside and closed the heavy wooden door. The room smelled of flour and dried herbs and the cold mineral scent of stone walls that never fully warmed regardless of season. A single candle burned on a shelf beside glass jars of preserved fruit, casting amber light across both their faces. "Tell me everything you know," Lucien said. His voice was stripped. No authority, no performance, just the raw frequency of a man operating without the architecture that had defined him for 41 years. "Everything you have learned, everything you have written in whatever record you have been keeping. I know you have been keeping one. You are too intelligent not to." Serafina studied his face for several seconds. She was looking for something specific, not sincerity. Sincerity was a surface quality that skilled liars replicated effortlessly. She was looking for structural damage. The kind of internal collapse that could not be faked because it altered the load-bearing elements of a man's expression in ways that no amount of practiced control could simulate. She found it. "Your brother controls 6 parliamentary votes directly through financial obligations and another 8 through Ashbourne's military network," she said. "The financial freeze will target your shipping interests first because those generate 40% of your operational revenue. Without them, your military contacts in the north cannot be sustained past February. The garrison rotations were accelerated specifically to remove your allied officers before they could be mobilized. How long before the parliamentary articles are filed?" "Dawn." Damien told Cedric the documents would be presented when the morning session convenes. That gives us 7 hours. It gives you 7 hours. I'm telling you what I know. I am not committing to what happens next. Lucien leaned against the pantry wall. The stone pressed cold through his evening coat. He closed his eyes and felt the machinery of his mind attempting to engage with the crisis the way it had engaged with every crisis before. Systematically. Strategically. Identifying leverage points and vulnerability windows and the specific sequence of actions that would produce optimal outcomes. But the machinery kept stalling. Every strategic pathway he constructed ran into the same wall. His operational infrastructure was compromised from the inside. His intelligence networks were feeding him designed information. His military contacts were being repositioned beyond reach. And the man orchestrating all of it knew his methods intimately because they were the same methods, learned from the same father, refined through the same philosophy of dominance and control. Fighting Damien was fighting a mirror image of himself that had spent 14 months preparing for this exact confrontation while Lucien had spent 14 months watching his wife. I cannot stop this through the channels I normally use, Lucien said. The admission cost him something visible. His jaw tightened, his breathing shifted. The muscles across his shoulders contracted with the specific tension of a body resisting the physical expression of a psychological collapse. My networks are compromised. My military resources are being isolated. My financial instruments will be frozen before I can redirect them. Yes. Which means the only option is something I have never done. Which is, ask for help from people who have no reason to give it. Serafina was quiet for a long time. The candle flame moved in a draft from beneath the door, making their shadows tremble against the walls. There is one person who has reason, she said finally. Lady Whitmore. Her charitable network reaches into 14 parliamentary households. She has no love for Ashbourne. His military campaigns displace 3,000 families from lands her charity supports. She has been looking for a reason to move against him. Lady Whitmore despises me. Lady Whitmore despises the version of you that has existed until tonight. Whether a different version might receive a different response is something you will not know unless you are willing to find out. Lucien opened his eyes. The candlelight caught the silver in his irises and turned them molten. He looked at Serafina with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not vulnerability exactly, something more specific. The look of a man standing at the edge of a method he had used his entire life and realizing that the next step required abandoning it entirely. Come with me, he said. That is not a request. That is a command disguised in softer clothing. Then I am asking, Serafina, I am asking you to come with me, not as my wife, not as my property, not as an asset in a political calculation, as the person who understands what I am facing better than I do and who has more reason than anyone alive to let me fall and is choosing not to. The words hung in the cold air between them. Flower dust floated through the candlelight like tiny pale witnesses. Serafina reached out and straightened the collar of his evening coat. The gesture was small and carried an intimacy that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with the specific bond that forms between two people who recognize they are standing inside the same disaster. If I come with you, she said, the guards are finished. The surveillance is finished. The intercepted letters, the planted staff, the cage you built around my life. All of it. Not tomorrow. Not when it is strategically convenient. Tonight. Tonight. Say it like you mean it. It is finished. All of it. Tonight. She searched his face one final time. Then she nodded once and opened the pantry door. They left Wintermere Palace through the kitchen entrance while the masquerade continued its glittering performance of civilized unity in the ballroom above. Their carriage driver, startled from sleep by Lucien's sharp command, had the horses moving within 3 minutes. The vehicle lurched onto the frozen road and turned north toward London, while snow accumulated on the roof with the patient weight of something that intended to stay. Inside the carriage, Lucien and Serafina sat side by side for the first time in their marriage. The arrangement was not discussed. It simply happened. Two people facing the same direction because the threat was no longer between them. It was ahead. They reached London at 4 in the morning. The city was dark and frozen and hostile. Gas lamps threw yellow circles on empty streets where ice made the cobblestones treacherous. Their carriage stopped first at Lady Whitmore's townhouse in Belgravia, where Lucien did something he had never done in his adult life. He stood on someone else's doorstep and waited. Lady Whitmore appeared in her dressing gown after the third knock, furious and sleep-deprived, and entirely unprepared for the sight of the Duke of Blackthorne standing in the snow with his wife beside him and his mask in his hand and his expression carrying the unmistakable signature of a man who had run out of alternatives. "Your Grace, it is 4 a.m, and I am not Lady Whitmore." Lucien's voice was steady, but carried none of the commanding weight she had heard at every previous encounter. "My brother is destroying my political infrastructure as we speak. By dawn, Ashbourne's coalition will present articles of condemnation to Parliament. I need access to your parliamentary network to deliver counterintelligence before the morning session convenes." "You need my help." Lady Whitmore repeated the phrase as though testing it for structural integrity. "The Iron Duke of Blackthorne needs my help." "Yes." "Give me one reason." "Because Ashbourne's coalition will not stop at me. Once Ravenscar influence is eliminated, the Northern Charitable Trust your network depends on will lose their parliamentary protection. Ashbourne has no interest in preserving social programs that do not generate military recruitment. Within 6 months of my removal, every displaced family your organization supports will lose their funding." Lady Whitmore studied him for 10 seconds. Then she looked at Serafina. "Is he telling the truth?" "He is telling the truth about the political consequences," Serafina said. "Whether he is telling the truth about why he is here, only the next few hours will determine." Lady Whitmore tightened the belt of her dressing gown and stepped aside. "You have until dawn, Your Grace. After that, you are on your own." The next 3 hours became the most intense operational period of Lucien's life, and for the first time he was not directing it alone. Lady Whitmore's drawing room transformed into a command center. Couriers were dispatched to 6 parliamentary households carrying sealed intelligence packets that Serafina had assembled from her private notebook. The packets contained documented evidence of Damien's coordination with Ashbourne, financial transfers that linked the coalition to foreign banking interests in violation of parliamentary ethics statutes, and testimony from 3 household servants who had witnessed Damien receiving sealed communications from Ashbourne's military contacts. Lucien watched Serafina work and felt something restructure itself inside his chest. She moved through the crisis with a competence that did not surprise him. He had known she was intelligent. What surprised him was the scope of what she had built while he was busy containing her. An entire shadow intelligence network constructed from charitable connections, social relationships, and the accumulated observations of a woman who had been underestimated by every powerful man in England. She had not built it to destroy him. She had built it because building was what capable people did when they were trapped. They constructed whatever they could reach. And the fact that what she had built now had the power to save him was not irony. It was the natural consequence of a simple truth he had refused to learn. The people you try to control become the people most motivated to develop capabilities you cannot predict. By 6 a.m, counterintelligence had reached 11 parliamentary households. By 6:30, 3 members of Ashbourne's coalition had received evidence of Damien's foreign banking connections and were reconsidering their positions. By 7, the morning session was delayed by 40 minutes while committee chairs reviewed conflicting documentation. But it was not enough. The parliamentary articles were filed at 7:50. Lucien Ravenscar was formally condemned as a threat to Crown stability and ordered to surrender his military commissions pending investigation. The vote was not unanimous. 6 members who had received Serafina's intelligence packets abstained, but the majority held. The Iron Duke's political infrastructure began its formal dismantlement while Lucien stood in Lady Whitmore's drawing room listening to the news delivered by a breathless courier who could not meet his eyes. Serafina watched him receive the verdict. His face did not change, his posture did not shift, but she could see the muscles in his throat working, the involuntary swallowing of a man processing a blow so fundamental that the body's autonomic systems responded before the conscious mind could construct a defense. "The northern garrisons," Lucien said quietly. "What is their status?" "Rotating as scheduled," the courier reported. "Your allied officers received transfer orders at dawn. Colonel Blackwood refused the transfer and has been placed under arrest. The others complied." Blackwood. Lucien's voice carried a flicker of something that might have been gratitude. One man. Out of every military contact he had cultivated over 20 years, one man had refused to abandon him. Where is he being held? Windermere Barracks. Lucien turned from the courier and walked to the window. London was waking up. Carriages moved through slush-covered streets. Chimney smoke rose into a gray sky that offered no comfort and no drama. Just the flat, indifferent light of a morning that did not care whose empire was falling. A man stripped of everything he built to define himself was not a man reduced. He was a man revealed. And what the revelation exposed was either something worth preserving or something that deserved to collapse. Lucien stood at the window and felt the answer to that question pressing against his ribs from the inside like a second heartbeat he had never noticed because the noise of power had been too loud. "We ride north," he said. Serafina stepped forward. "Lucien, the northern roads are—" Blackwood is the only officer who stood. If Damien reaches him first, the last piece of military loyalty I have left disappears. He turned from the window. His eyes had changed. The silver was harder now. Not with the cold authority of the old Lucien, but with something leaner. The stripped-down focus of a man who had lost everything except the specific knowledge of what still mattered. "I am not asking you to come. The roads are dangerous, and what waits at the end of them may be worse." "I know what waits," Serafina said. "I mapped it." She picked up her coat from the chair where she had draped it 3 hours ago. "And if you think I assembled all of that intelligence just to watch you ride into the result alone, you have not been paying attention, again." They rode north on borrowed horses because their carriage was too slow and the roads too compromised for wheeled transport. Lady Whitmore provided the mounts and a single-armed escort, a former cavalry officer named Harding, who asked no questions and rode with the efficient silence of a man who understood that the value of his service increased in direct proportion to the amount of talking he did not do. The journey took 6 hours through frozen English countryside that punished every mile. Wind cut through their clothing. Ice made the roads treacherous. Twice they detoured through farmland to avoid checkpoints where Ashbourne's military contacts had established informal observation posts watching for exactly this kind of movement. Lucien rode with the brutal endurance of a man whose body had been trained to absorb punishment without complaint. But Serafina matched his pace without falling behind, and the sight of her riding beside him through the frozen landscape produced a sensation he could not categorize. Not admiration, something more dangerous. Recognition. The specific awareness of seeing someone clearly for the first time after years of looking at a version you constructed yourself. She was not the woman he had married. She had never been the woman he had married. That woman was a fiction he had created to fit the architecture of his needs. The real Serafina was harder, sharper, more capable, and more terrifying than anything his imagination had produced. And she was here, riding north through hostile territory to help a man who had spent 4 years trying to cage her. The why of it would take him years to understand, if he survived. They reached the Windermere military barracks at dusk. The facility was a gray stone compound on the edge of moorland, surrounded by a low wall that provided defensive structure against weather, but not against determined assault. Smoke rose from the barracks chimneys. Lanterns burned in the guardhouse. The compound had the tense, watchful atmosphere of a military installation operating under contradictory orders. Lucien dismounted and handed his reins to Harding. His legs burned from 6 hours of hard riding. His hands were numb. His face had been scoured raw by wind and ice until the skin felt like something that belonged to a different body. "The colonel," he said to the guard at the gate. "Where is he held?" The guard recognized Lucien. The recognition produced a visible conflict. The man's training demanded deference to a duke. His orders demanded compliance with parliamentary directives. The two imperatives collided behind his eyes like weather systems meeting over open water. "Your Grace, I have orders that Colonel Blackwood is to receive no visitors pending." "Those orders came from men who have never stood where you are standing." Lucien's voice carried a quality the guard had not expected. Not command, not threat. Something raw. "I am not here to override your orders, soldier. I am here because one man refused to abandon his post when every other officer complied. And I intend to look that man in the eye before anyone decides what happens next." The guard hesitated for 12 seconds. Then he stepped aside. Lucien found Blackwood in a holding cell on the ground floor of the barracks. The room was small, cold, and lit by a single window set high in the stone wall. Blackwood was sitting on a wooden bench with his uniform still buttoned and his boots still polished, and his hands resting on his knees with the patience of a man who had made his decision and was prepared to absorb whatever consequences followed. He was 54 years old, career military, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same Yorkshire stone that built the barracks around him. He stood when Lucien entered, not at attention, not with theatrical respect, with the simple, automatic response of a soldier recognizing a commanding presence. "Colonel, Your Grace, you refused the transfer." "I did." "Why?" Blackwood considered the question with the deliberate attention of a man for whom words were ammunition and waste was unacceptable. "Because the transfer order was illegitimate. It bypassed 3 levels of command authorization, and because I do not take orders from men who hide their intentions behind procedural language." "You will face court-martial." "I expect so." "You could lose your commission, your pension, everything you have built in 30 years of service." Blackwood's expression did not change. "Your Grace, I have spent 30 years following orders from men who earned the right to give them. When orders arrive from men who have not earned that right, refusing is not defiance. It is the last professional obligation I have left." Lucien stood in the cold cell looking at the one man who had stood when everyone else complied. Not because of loyalty to Lucien personally, not because of political calculation, because of a principle that existed independent of who benefited from it. This was what loyalty looked like when it was not purchased. The realization struck something deep inside Lucien's chest, a place he had armored so thoroughly that he had forgotten it existed. But armor was not the same as absence. The thing beneath it was still alive, still capable of response, just buried so deep that only the complete demolition of everything built on top of it could reach it. "I will get you out of here," Lucien said. "With respect, Your Grace, you cannot get yourself out of here. The barracks commander received orders to detain you on sight if you appeared. You walk through the front gate, which means you have approximately 15 minutes before someone with more authority than that gate guard arrives to execute those orders." Lucien turned to the cell window. Through the narrow opening, he could see the barracks yard where soldiers were moving with the increased tempo of a facility responding to an unexpected development. Lanterns were being lit. Voices carried across the frozen ground with the sharp cadence of military communication. "Then we have 15 minutes, Lucien said. "To do what?" "To find out whether the man I am becoming is worth the empire I have lost." Outside the cell, boots struck stone in the corridor, multiple footsteps, moving with purpose. And through the barracks yard, visible through the narrow window, a carriage arrived bearing a seal that Lucien recognized with the visceral certainty of a man seeing his own reflection in a weapon aimed at his face. Damien's seal. His brother had anticipated this move the way he had anticipated every move. The chess game that began 14 months ago was reaching its final position. And Lucien Ravenscar, stripped of armies, stripped of political infrastructure, stripped of every weapon he had ever used to bend the world to his will, stood in a cold military cell with a single loyal officer and heard his brother's boots approaching down the corridor with the measured cadence of a man arriving to collect what he believed he had already won. Serafina appeared in the cell doorway. Her face was flushed from cold and exertion, her hair loosened from the ride, her eyes carrying the fierce clarity of a woman who had chosen her ground and intended to hold it. "Damien is here," she said. "He brought 12 men, armed." Lucien looked at Blackwood, looked at Serafina, looked at the narrow window where the last gray light of January was dying across the Yorkshire moors. 3 people, no army, no political leverage, no escape route. And somewhere in the corridor, growing louder with each step, the sound of the brother who had dismantled everything Lucien Ravenscar ever built, coming to finish what remained. The boots stopped outside the cell door. Lucien counted the silence the way a man counts the distance between lightning and thunder, measuring how close the strike has come. 3 seconds. 5. The kind of deliberate pause that belonged to someone who understood the psychological value of making another man wait. Damien had learned that from their father, too. The door opened. Lucien Ravenscar entered the holding cell, flanked by two armed soldiers whose faces carried the professionally blank expressions of men being paid well enough to avoid asking questions about what they were doing. He wore riding clothes instead of evening dress, and the change in costume told its own story. The masquerade was over. The masks were off. What remained was the raw transaction of power that had always been happening beneath the performance. Damien's silver eyes moved across the room, found Blackwood standing at military attention beside the bench, found Serafina in the doorway with her jaw set and her hands at her sides, found Lucien standing in the center of the cell with his back to the narrow window and the last light of January dying behind him like something that had finally given up trying. "You came north," Damien said. "I thought you might." It is exactly the kind of decision a man makes when his strategic mind stops functioning and his instincts take over. Instincts are sentimental, Lucien. They send you toward the people who matter to you instead of toward the moves that could actually save you. "Maybe saving the people who matter is the move," Lucien said. Damien tilted his head, a gesture of genuine curiosity, almost scientific, as though his brother had produced a data point that did not fit the existing model. "That is new. That does not sound like you. It does not sound like the version of me you prepared for, which means your preparation has a gap." "My preparation has no gaps. I have spent 14 months mapping every response pattern you possess, every strategic reflex, every psychological trigger. I know you better than you know yourself, Lucien, because I studied you the way you study enemies, thoroughly, dispassionately, with the specific goal of identifying the exact sequence of pressures that would cause you to collapse." Damien stepped further into the cell. His soldiers remained in the doorway, blocking it with their bodies and the dull gleam of sidearms visible beneath their coats. "And here you are, collapsed." "Here I am," Lucien agreed. His voice carried an unfamiliar quality. Not defeat, something adjacent to defeat that contained, buried inside it like a seed inside frozen ground, the possibility of something Damien had not calculated for: acceptance. Standing in a cell with no army, no political infrastructure, no financial leverage, and no way out. Everything you planned, everything you built. It worked, Damien. Congratulations. You won. The admission landed in the cold air between them and produced a reaction Lucien had anticipated, a flicker of confusion crossing Damien's face. Because victory, when it arrives without resistance, does not feel like victory. It feels like a trap. "You are conceding," Damien said carefully. "I am describing reality. You dismantled my empire. You turned my intelligence networks against me. You isolated my military contacts. You used my own methods with surgical precision because you learned them at the same table I did. Every move I made in the last 14 months was a move you designed for me to make. I was playing your game on your board with your pieces and calling it strategy." Lucien paused. "The only thing you did not plan for is what happens when I stop playing. What happens is you lose. I have already lost. That is the part you are having difficulty processing. A man who has already lost everything has nothing left to threaten and nothing left to protect. Which means the machinery you built to threaten and exploit my protections no longer has a target." Lucien's eyes held his brother's with a steadiness that should not have been possible for a man in his position. "You prepared for the Duke of Blackthorne. You did not prepare for whatever is standing in front of you right now, because neither of us knows what that is yet." Damien's composure shifted, not cracking, recalibrating. He was running the conversation through the model of his brother that he had spent 14 months constructing, and the inputs were not producing the outputs the model predicted. Lucien should have been threatening, negotiating, attempting to leverage whatever residual authority remained in his title and reputation. Those were the responses the model anticipated, the responses Damien had countermeasures for. Quiet honesty was not in the model. "You think surrender will save you," Damien said. "I think surrender is the only honest thing I have done in 20 years. And I think the fact that you do not know how to respond to it tells you something about the limitations of the philosophy we were both taught." Lucien took one step toward his brother. The soldiers in the doorway tensed. Serafina's hand moved to the wall beside her, steadying herself against whatever was about to happen. Father taught us that strength was the only currency that never devalues. He was wrong. Strength is the currency that costs the most to maintain, and the maintenance cost is everything else, everything human, everything that cannot be acquired through force or defended through control. Spare me the deathbed conversion, Lucien. You spent 4 decades ruling through fear, and you want me to believe that one bad week has transformed you into a philosopher. I do not want you to believe anything. I want you to look at me and see what you are about to become. Lucien's voice dropped, not to a whisper, to the low, specific frequency of a man delivering information he wished were not true. You won. You will take the Ravenscar name, the political machinery, whatever financial instruments survived the parliamentary investigation. You will sit in the rooms where I sat. You will make the decisions I made. And within 2 years, you will be exactly what I was. A man so consumed by the maintenance of power that he cannot remember what he wanted the power for. I am nothing like you. You are identical to me. That is why your plan worked. You understood my architecture because it is your architecture. The same blueprint, the same materials, the same fundamental design flaw. Lucien's eyes did not waver. We were both built by a man who believed that needing another person was weakness. And we both became men who destroy the people closest to us because closeness feels like vulnerability and vulnerability feels like death. The cell was silent. Outside, wind moved across the Yorkshire moors with the low, continuous sound of something vast and indifferent passing through. The soldiers in the doorway exchanged glances. Blackwood stood motionless beside the bench, watching the 2 brothers with the professional attention of a man who had spent 30 years observing the specific mechanics of command and recognized that something was happening in this room that no military manual had ever documented. Damien's expression underwent a change that was visible only to someone who knew his face as intimately as a brother. The muscles around his mouth tightened. His jaw shifted forward by a millimeter. His eyes, identical to Lucien's in color, developed a brightness that was not anger and was not triumph and was not anything that could be named without admitting that the man experiencing it was afraid. "You do not get to do this," Damien said. His voice had lost its composed, analytical quality. Something rougher had surfaced, something that sounded like the voice of a younger son standing in his father's study being told, again, that his contributions were adequate but not exceptional. "You do not get to spend 40 years being the monster and then stand in a cell and lecture me about humanity. You built the machine, Lucien. You ran the machine. You crushed everyone who got close to the machine. And now that someone has finally broken it, you want to pretend you were a prisoner inside it the whole time." "I was. That is convenient." "It is not convenient. It is the most inconvenient truth I have ever faced. Because admitting that I was trapped inside my own machinery means admitting that everything I did to Serafina, everything I did to you, everything I destroyed and everyone I damaged was not the action of a man exercising power. It was the action of a man so terrified of being vulnerable that he would rather cage the people he loved than risk them choosing to leave." Damien flinched. The word loved landed on him like a hand against a wound he had forgotten was still open. And in that flinch, in that involuntary muscular response that no amount of strategic preparation could suppress, Lucien saw the 14-year-old boy who had followed his older brother through the corridors of Blackthorne Castle with the desperate, unspeakable hope that following well enough, performing well enough, being useful enough would eventually earn something that their father's philosophy explicitly prohibited. Connection. "I should have protected you," Lucien said. "Not from external threats, not from political enemies, from the thing inside our own house that turned us both into instruments instead of people. I was older. I was stronger. I should have stood between you and Father's philosophy instead of perfecting it, and I did not. That failure is mine. Not because I lacked the ability, because I lacked the courage." Damien's breathing changed. The controlled, measured rhythm that had sustained his composure since entering the cell developed an irregularity, a hitch. The physical signature of a man whose emotional infrastructure was experiencing stress that exceeded its design specifications. "Stop," Damien said. "I cannot stop. I have been stopped for 40 years. I have been frozen inside a version of myself that was built to survive our father's house, and I have kept that version running long after the original threat ended because dismantling it felt identical to dying. But it is not dying, Damien. It is the opposite. And the fact that I had to lose everything before I could see that does not make the scene less real. I said stop. Damien's voice cracked on the second word. A hairline fracture that ran through the single syllable and split it into something raw and exposed. His hand moved to his sidearm, not drawing it, resting on it. The gesture of a man reaching for the tool he understood when the situation demanded a tool he did not possess. Serafina stepped forward from the doorway. Damien! Her voice cut through the charged air between the brothers with the precise, careful tone of a woman who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this room produced transformation or violence. He is not performing. I have watched this man perform for 4 years. I know every mask he owns. I catalog them to survive. This is not a mask. You are defending him, Damien said, after everything he did to you. I am not defending him. I am telling you what I see. Because someone in this room needs to be trusted, and neither of you has earned that from each other yet. But I have earned it from both of you. I have earned it by surviving what you each did to me for your own reasons. Her voice hardened without rising. You used me as a variable in your strategy, Damien. You told Cedric I was the key to everything. You were willing to let whatever happened to me during your coup become collateral damage as long as it served the objective of destroying your brother. Do not stand there and pretend your cause is clean. Damien's hand slid away from the sidearm. The movement was slow, deliberate. The physical equivalent of a man setting down a weapon he had been holding so long that his fingers had forgotten how to open. What do you want? Damien said. The question was directed at both of them, or at neither of them, or at the room itself, which had become a space where the rules governing the Ravenscar family for 4 generations were being tested against something they had never encountered: honesty. I want to stop, Lucien said, not strategically, not as a negotiating position. I want to stop being the thing our father built. I want to walk out of this room and not rebuild, not reconstruct the empire, not find new leverage or new networks or new mechanisms of control. I want to find out if there is a version of me that can exist without owning everything within reach. And the title, the lands, the political infrastructure. Take them. The 2 words dropped into the silence like stones into deep water. Damien stared at his brother. Blackwood shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. The soldiers in the doorway looked at each other with the disoriented expressions of men witnessing something their training had not prepared them to process. You cannot mean that, Damien said. I have never meant anything more in my life. And the fact that you find it impossible to believe tells you exactly how broken we both are. We were raised in a house where giving something away was indistinguishable from losing it, where releasing control was identical to death, where the only acceptable posture was grip. Grip and hold and never let go and call it strength, while your hands turn into claws, and everything you touch turns into something that wishes you would stop touching it. Lucien's voice carried the weight of a man speaking truths that had been accumulating behind a dam for decades. I am letting go, Damien. Not because I am weak, because holding on has cost me everything that mattered, and I would rather be the man who released than the man who crushed. The wind outside intensified. The narrow window rattled in its frame. January darkness had fully consumed the moors, turning the world beyond the barracks into a featureless void that offered no landmarks and no directions. Just open space and cold, and the absence of everything familiar. Lucien Ravenscar stood in a military holding cell, looking at his brother, and felt the 14-month architecture of his revenge encounter something it had not been designed to withstand. Not resistance, not counterattack, not any of the strategic responses he had mapped and prepared countermeasures for during months of meticulous planning. Surrender. Not the surrender of weakness. The surrender of a man who had finally understood that the war he was fighting had no winning position, only varying degrees of loss, and the least destructive loss was the one you chose voluntarily. Damien turned to his soldiers. Wait outside. The soldiers hesitated. Damien's voice sharpened. Outside. Now. They withdrew. The cell door remained open. Cold air from the corridor mixed with the cold air from the window and turned the small room into a space where temperature and emotion reached the same level. Near freezing, stripped of comfort, honest. Damien sat down on the wooden bench. The gesture was so unexpected, so radically foreign to the posture of a man who had entered the room as a conqueror, that Blackwood stepped back involuntarily. Generals did not sit on prisoners' benches. Victors did not lower themselves to the furniture of the defeated. But Damien was not sitting as a victor. He was sitting as a man whose legs no longer supported the weight of what he was carrying. "I spent 14 months building this," Damien said quietly. "Every day, every hour, mapping your networks, cultivating Ashbourne, designing the parliamentary coalition, timing the military rotations. I built it the way you build everything, perfectly, ruthlessly, without any space for the possibility that destroying you might also destroy the last piece of myself that still resembled something worth keeping. And now," Lucien said, "and now I am sitting in a cell with the brother I was trying to destroy, and he is saying things that our father would have beaten out of either of us before we finished the sentence. And the worst part is that I believe him." Damien looked up. His silver eyes were bright with moisture he was not yet willing to release. "I believe you, Lucien. And I do not know what to do with that, because my entire plan was built on the certainty that you were incapable of this. I was incapable of this, until I lost enough to discover that I was not." The brothers looked at each other across the narrow cell. Between them lay 4 decades of shared damage, shared philosophy, shared architecture, built by a man who loved his sons the only way he knew how, which was by turning them into weapons and calling it preparation. Serafina watched from the doorway with the silent attention of a woman who understood that what was happening in this room was not reconciliation. Reconciliation was a process that took years and required sustained effort and often failed. What was happening was something more preliminary and more essential. 2 men standing in the wreckage of their father's legacy and making the first, tentative, terrifying decision to stop rebuilding it. "Come outside," Serafina said softly. "Both of you. There is nothing left to resolve in this room." They walked out of the barracks into the January night. The moors stretched in every direction under a sky that had finally cleared, revealing stars in quantities that were invisible from London and overwhelming from Yorkshire. The cold was absolute, the kind of cold that stripped away pretense and social architecture and left only the basic animal experience of being alive in a world that did not care whether you survived but offered beauty anyway. Damien's soldiers stood in a loose group near their horses, confused by orders that had not arrived and uncertain about the protocol for a situation that no briefing had covered. Harding waited with their borrowed mounts, his professional silence unbroken, his assessment of the situation limited to the tactically relevant observation that nobody appeared to be shooting. Blackwood emerged last. He stood apart from both brothers and looked at the sky with the expression of a man who had expected to spend the night in a cell and instead found himself standing under stars he had not planned to see again. "Colonel," Lucien said, "Your Grace, I owe you a debt I cannot repay through any mechanism I previously understood, so I will try something I have never tried before." Lucien extended his hand, not the formal, angular gesture of an aristocrat acknowledging a subordinate, an open hand offered at the level of a man acknowledging an equal. "Thank you. For standing when standing was not required." Blackwood looked at the hand for 3 seconds. Then he shook it with the firm, economical grip of a man for whom physical contact was a commitment rather than a courtesy. "What happens now, Your Grace?" "I am not certain that title still applies, Colonel." "With respect, sir, the title has nothing to do with it." The group stood in the cold dark of the Yorkshire moors while the implications of the evening settled around them like snowfall. Damien gave orders to his soldiers to stand down. The words came out of his mouth with a halting, unfamiliar quality, as though the language of releasing control contained sounds his vocal cords had never been asked to produce. The soldiers obeyed with the confused compliance of men who understood the individual words but not the sentence they formed. Serafina stood beside Lucien, not touching him, not performing proximity, simply occupying the same space with the quiet deliberation of a woman who had chosen her position and intended to hold it until the reasons for holding it either proved themselves or failed. "The parliamentary condemnation will proceed," Damien said, addressing his brother across the frozen ground between them. I cannot stop it, even if I wanted to. Ashbourne's coalition has enough independent momentum to carry the vote without my coordination. I know. You will lose the military commissions, most of the northern properties. The shipping interests will be contested in court for years. I know. What will you do? Lucien looked north. Beyond the barracks, beyond the moors, beyond the visible edge of the world he had spent his life trying to control, the horizon was a line of absolute darkness separating earth from sky. He studied that line the way he had once studied political maps and financial ledgers and the faces of men he intended to break, with total attention, with the specific focus of a man trying to read something that would determine everything that came after. But the horizon was not a document. It was not a strategy. It was not a problem to be solved or a threat to be neutralized. It was just distance. Open and unmarked and offering nothing except the possibility that whatever came next would not be built on the same crumbling foundation as everything that came before. I will find out, Lucien said. Months later, on a stretch of northern coastline, where the cliffs dropped 200 feet to water that was never warm and never still, a stone cottage stood against the wind with the stubborn persistence of something that had been built to endure rather than impress. The walls were thick, the windows were small, the roof had been repaired twice in the last 3 months by hands that were learning, slowly and with considerable error, how to do work that did not involve the destruction or acquisition of anything. Lucien woke each morning before dawn, not because discipline demanded it, because the sound of the sea entered the cottage through the stone walls and reached some part of him that had been deaf for 40 years and was now, gradually, learning to hear. He repaired fences. He walked the cliffs. He spent hours in a small workshop behind the cottage where he was teaching himself to build furniture from local timber, and the process was humbling in ways that empire building had never been. Wood did not respond to intimidation. Joints did not hold because you commanded them to hold. Every piece required patience, precision, and the willingness to start over when the result did not match the intention. Starting over. The two words that had terrified him more than any political threat or military challenge. Starting over meant admitting that what came before was insufficient. Starting over meant standing in front of the raw materials of a life and accepting that the previous construction was flawed in ways that no amount of renovation could correct. Starting over meant becoming someone you had never been, using tools you had never learned, in a landscape that did not care about your previous accomplishments. Serafina lived in the cottage. That sentence, in its simplicity, contained more complexity than any political negotiation Lucien had ever conducted. She lived there because she chose to live there. She could leave at any time. The doors were not watched. The correspondence was not intercepted. No guards stood at the perimeter monitoring her movements with reports delivered to a master who required control the way other men required oxygen. She stayed because something was happening between them that neither could name, and both were afraid to examine too closely. Not love, in the operatic sense that poets and novelists had commodified into a consumer product. Something harder. Something that grew in the space left behind when two people stopped performing their assigned roles and stood in front of each other without scripts. Some mornings they spoke. Some mornings they did not. The silence between them had changed. In Blackthorne Castle, silence had been a weapon. Here, on the northern cliffs where the wind made speech difficult and unnecessary, silence was simply the natural condition of two people sharing a landscape without needing to fill it with justification. Damien wrote letters. Not frequently. The first arrived 2 months after the barracks, a single page written in handwriting that was more careful than Damien's usual script, as though the words had been drafted multiple times before the final version was committed to paper. The content was practical. Updates on the parliamentary proceedings. The status of Ravenscar properties under new administration. A brief, almost parentless mention that Cedric Ashbourne had been quietly removed from political influence after evidence surfaced of financial irregularities in his military procurement records. Evidence that Serafina had assembled and Lady Whitmore had delivered. The second letter, arriving 3 months after the first, contained a single sentence that Lucien read 7 times before setting the paper down on his workshop bench and sitting very still for a long time. I'm trying to learn what you are learning. It is harder than anything I have ever done. Lucien did not reply immediately. He spent 3 days considering what to write, not because the response required strategic calculation, because honest communication, after a lifetime of weaponized language, required a kind of effort that made physical labor feel simple by comparison. He eventually wrote 4 words and sent them north. It does not get easier. One evening in late spring, when the coastline had softened from the brutal gray of winter into something greener and less hostile, Serafina found Lucien standing at the cliff edge where the land ended and the sea began. The sun was setting behind cloud formations that turned the water copper and violet in shades of color that did not have names because naming them would have reduced them to something smaller than what they were. She stood beside him. The wind moved through the tall grass between the cliff edge and the cottage, making the landscape sound like something breathing. "You have not built anything new," she said. Lucien understood what she meant. Not furniture, not fences, not the practical constructions that occupied his days. She meant the other kind of building. The political kind. The strategic kind. The kind that had defined every waking hour of his previous existence. "No." "Do you miss it?" He considered the question with the same attention he gave to every question she asked. Not because she demanded careful answers, because she deserved them. "I miss the certainty," he said. "I miss knowing exactly what I was doing and why I was doing it, and what the outcomes would be. I miss the architecture, the feeling of standing inside something I built and knowing it was solid." He paused. "I do not miss who I was inside that architecture. I do not miss the man who needed walls around everything he valued because the alternative was trusting that the things he valued might choose to stay on their own." Serafina did not respond immediately. She watched the sunset change the water from copper to deep purple and let the silence hold the weight of what he had said without rushing to fill it. "I am choosing to stay," she said finally. "Not because the cage is gone, not because you have changed enough to earn it, not because any calculation or negotiation or strategic framework has produced an optimal outcome." She turned to face him. The evening light caught her dark eyes and turned them into something he could look at for the rest of his life without ever fully understanding. "I am choosing to stay because the man standing next to me is someone I have never met before, and I want to find out who he becomes." Lucien looked at her. The wind off the sea moved through his hair and pulled at his shirt and pressed against his chest with the patient, indifferent force of something that had been moving since before humans existed and would continue moving long after they were gone. He did not reach for her hand. He opened his hand and held it at his side, palm up, and waited. The gesture contained everything he had learned in the months since his empire collapsed. That you could not take what mattered. That you could not secure what mattered. That the only access to the things worth having was through the terrifying, structurally unsound, completely indefensible act of offering yourself without guarantee of return. Serafina looked at his open hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the horizon where the last light was dissolving into the sea. Then she placed her hand in his, not because he commanded it, not because the architecture of power or obligation or survival demanded it. Because in the space between two people who had damaged each other and survived each other and were still, against all reasonable expectation, standing in the same place at the same time, there existed a possibility that neither control nor surrender could produce. Choice. And the man who had once believed that power was the only truth worth defending stood on a cliff top at the edge of the world he had lost and discovered that the most terrifying and valuable thing a human being could possess was not an empire. It was the willingness to stand in the open with nothing and trust that what came next might be enough. The wind carried the last of the daylight out across the water. The stars appeared one by one, indifferent and ancient and beautiful. And two people who had nearly destroyed each other stood together on the northern cliffs, holding hands in the gathering dark, while somewhere behind them the cottage windows glowed with the warm, imperfect light of a life that was just beginning to be built.